Our church bell tolls, and from the belfry hangs a secret no prayer can silence. Welcome to Phantom Mystery. I am your host, Edmund Cross. I love seeing this community grow. Tell me where you're tuning in from today. Your voices bring these mysteries to life. Let's begin. St. Anselm's, with its modest square tower and patchwork of lichened stone, had never aspired to grandeur. It was a village church for a village that prized neat hedges, clean doormats, and the sort of small hypocrisies that kept the peace. That evening the bells were rung not for a wedding or a funeral, but for the harvest festival rehearsal, an unassuming purpose that by long tradition drew more criticism than carols. The chrysanthemums had been arranged with fierce diplomacy. Mrs. Pym, the vicar's wife, had surrendered her orange pompons in favour of Mrs. Clegg's more respectable whites, and an elderly gentleman had been persuaded not to set his marrow on the altar. This was, as Miss Hart observed to her guest, exactly the sort of domestic warfare upon which English civilization rested. Miss Jane Marple, who understood civilization in all its delicate compromises better than most generals, had come from St. Mary Mead to spend a fortnight with her friend Emmeline Hart at Rose Cottage. "A change," Miss Hart had written, "will do you good, Jane. Our village is asleep half the time. You may prescribe a brisk constitutional of scandal." Miss Marple, knitting a sock of sound but economical wool, had smiled and sent back a reply that expressed something agreeable about fresh air and peace. Experience had taught her that the words "asleep half the time" often concealed exactly the other half, wakefulness of a fretful, prying sort like a cat's at dusk. So it was that, on this particular evening washed in a pale autumn light, two elderly ladies walked up the gravel path of St. Anselm's and took seats, softly, as if their bones respected old wood, in the pew near the south door. The organist, Mr. Basil Kerr, a thin man whose grey hair lay upon his scalp like a motto about respectability, was coaxing the organ into a hymn. Over this floated the odour of beeswax polish, and some faint medicinal scent with which Miss Marple found herself familiar, though she could not at once place it. Carbolic? No, not quite. Something sharper, with a peppermint edge. She made a small mental note, and drew her thread through the needles with modest pleasure. Across the nave, Mrs. Pym conducted a parade of arrangements, wheat sheaves bound with ribbon, a loaf shaped rather ambitiously like a pigeon, jars of honey whose labels read G. Welland and Son in a boyish, hopeful hand. Young George Welland, the son in question, had appeared with an eager, embarrassed pride, his sleeves rolled and his hair slicked down as if the jars would notice. Standing with him was his father, Tom Welland, the tower captain of the bell-ringers, broad-shouldered, honest-faced and too quick, Miss Marple observed, to glance at the west door whenever it opened. "Tom expects someone," murmured Miss Hart, leaning close, "or dreads someone. You know how it is. Arthur Pym says they're short a ringer since Mr. Bellamy had his fall, from the ladder." Miss Marple's needles clicked. "They say so. He is at home with a bandaged head and a temper. Nasty business. Arthur Pym thinks the bells will never come right if we go on losing men." Miss Marple, whose interest in bell-ringing was chiefly sociological, watched as the ringers shuffled into the tower, Tom Welland first with that self-conscious glance, then George, thin as a reed but bright-eyed, then Mr. Cranch, the grocer, who wore the look of a man committing a noble deed against his inclination, and finally a newcomer to the village, Dr. Lucas Brent, whose arrival some weeks earlier had given the village a replacement for old Dr. Hawes and a fresh object for curiosity. Dr. Brent was young for a doctor, clean-shaven and perhaps too handsome, in a way that invited confidences. He had a habit of looking intently at people with a sort of considerate impatience, as if the human body were always late for its appointments. "Doctors shouldn't ring," Miss Hart whispered. "It makes one nervous when one sees the person who might attend one's end tugging a rope like that." "It teaches humility," said Miss Marple, who felt that humility was like knitting, a practical virtue rather than an ornament. Her gaze drifted to the porch, where Lady Eugenia Ashworth, a widow with funds and executive opinions, issued brisk instructions to a girl with a spray of ivy in her hair. That must be Jessie, the maid from the hall recently promoted to under-housemaid, and enjoying the dangerous exhilaration of being noticed. The bells began. St. Anselm's Tower, modest as it was, sent down a music like tin coins struck very properly. No flourish, only a sober peal that made Miss Marple think of receipts and balances. Tom Welland's arm rose and fell with authority. George followed, determined and careful. Mr. Cranch's face arranged itself into a grimace of duty, and Dr. Brent, glancing once towards the nave, oddly towards Miss Marple herself, drew with a steady, measured strength. "It is a pity," Miss Hart said, "that Miss Clegg has chosen to bring her Welsh cakes. They will ruin everything. She never washes her cooling racks, and she calls it seasoning." "Seasoning is a question of degrees," Miss Marple murmured, thinking again of that faint, sharp odour, now mixing unpleasantly with beeswax and damp stone. She lifted her head, attentive. The bells did not falter. They marched on with that good-humoured self-importance bell towers possess when they are not very large. People came and went. Mr. Kerr trod resignedly at the pedals and coaxed the organ into All Things Bright and Beautiful, which suited the chrysanthemums, and the pigeon loaf, like a hymn, suits a sensible hat. Somewhere behind the tower door, a rope thudded on stone. The interruption, if one could call it an interruption of a sort that electrified the air, came with an oddly polite sound. Not a scream precisely, but the short, surprised exclamation of a woman who has found something entirely out of place. It came from the spiral stair to the belfry, from the dim, narrow coil that smelt of dust and iron. The ringers paused, the ropes shivered, and then there was the unmistakable crash of a rope end released, and the dull, dreadful hush of persons who know at once that a scene is beginning, and they are in it. "George?" Tom's voice roughened. "Hold there, lad," but George had already let go. He was halfway to the stair, his face without colour. Miss Hart put a hand to her bosom in the manner of ladies who could not recall where they had last seen their salts. Lady Eugenia lifted her chin, as if to recognize the event and paste it into order later. Dr. Brent's eyes went to the stair and then, briefly, to the nave. He made a decision. One saw it flick over his face like a coat being shrugged on, and strode for the tower door. "Not you?" Mrs. Pym called, as if embarrassed by the tone of the thing. "Oh, do let Arthur." But the vicar, poor man, was caught at the west entrance by a parishioner with a question about hymn-sheets, and could not in a decent Christian manner abandon him. It was Miss Jessie, ivy askew and mouth open, who had made the exclamation, and now, as two more villagers pressed to the stair, her voice floated down in a delayed wail. Oh, sir, don't—" "It will be best if everyone keeps quite still," Miss Marple said, without raising her voice. There was something about her way of addressing a room that made obedience seem good manners. "Mrs. Pym, perhaps you and Mr. Kerr will be so kind as to ask the people to remain in their places." Mrs. Pym, usually sure of herself, only when scolding ribbon arrangements, surprised herself by obeying. Mr. Kerr smoothed his hair and announced, with a ghastly smile, that there was a slight matter in the tower that must be seen to, and would everyone be so kind as to keep the aisles clear. It was not elegant, but it served. There followed in the quiet the scuffle of feet on stone, and the dry, scraping complaint of the spiral stair as bodies negotiated its mean turns. Miss Marple did not move. She knew the truth of crowded scenes. One sees very much by not being in the way. She looked down at her knitting, which lay decorously in her lap, and, because habit is a solace, counted stitches. The first to return from the stair was young George Welland, though return was not exactly the word. He emerged, stopped at the foot of the stair, and leaned his head against the wall with eyes shut. The sharp scent in the church grew stronger for a moment around him. Peppermint, Miss Marple thought again, but not the sort that comforted. Then Dr. Brent came, and behind him Tom Welland, carrying the awkward gravity of a man whose world has been upset. Dr. Brent's hands were very clean, which Miss Marple noticed because they trembled a little, and because clean hands have their own emphasis in a church. "I'm afraid," Dr. Brent said to Mrs. Pym, who had hurried forward, "that Miss Jessie has seen something shocking. I'll manage. If someone could fetch Sergeant Barnes from the station." He turned, and his voice, which had been gentle, became brisk, the professional kindness that is also a wall. "Mr. Welland, keep your son with you. No one else up, please. What is it?" Mrs. Pym whispered. And then, apologetic, as if the dead might be angry to be discussed, "Who is it?" Dr. Brent looked at Miss Marple. It was momentary and not truly an appeal, rather a recognition, as if he had seen such a figure before at other scenes and knew that it altered the arithmetic. He said quietly, "A man." "In the Belfry?" "I can't be sure of, well, anything yet. But there is a rope about the neck. Suicide. It was Lady Eugenia," in a tone that tried to sound inconsistent with melodrama. "Possibly," Dr. Brent said. "Possibly not." A few people crossing themselves made the sign with embarrassed haste, as if the gesture, like a foreign language, might betray them. Mrs. Pym fluttered and then, becoming efficient, sent a boy sprinting for Sergeant Barnes. Miss Hart took Miss Marple's hand very briefly under the pew rail and squeezed it. "You won't go near it, will you?" she breathed, to which Miss Marple replied with a faint smile, "I shall not go where I am not wanted." "Dear." The business of waiting assembled itself like a congregation, whispering ill-contained curiosity, and in the midst of it, a dead seriousness that St. Anselm's had not seen since the last war. When Sergeant Barnes arrived, short, pink, and given to careful phrases, he took a look up the stair, came down with lips pressed together, and bowed to the vicar. "We must keep everyone here, sir, until we know who... until the doctor has, well, if I may ask names. We'll want names." Names began to organize themselves, and with them the village, Mrs. Clegg's hand on her wicker basket. Mr. Cranch the grocer still clutching his hat, Jessie sitting with her head between her knees on the lowest stair, and Lady Eugenia standing as if chairing a meeting of fate. The ringers, subdued and uncertain, kept together, near the tower door as men do near the scenes of labour and disaster. Tom Welland's hand was on his son's shoulder. Dr. Brent, looking older in that moment than he had looked on his first day, spoke quietly to Sergeant Barnes, and then went back up the stair. Miss Marple did not think of the body. She thought instead of the little things that attach themselves to bodies like mayflies to a stream, the rope end that thudded on stone, the boy's face as he came down the stair, and the sharp peppermint smell that had become frank now, not like a sweet, but like a thing designed to correct or disguise. She allowed her gaze to wander, and found on the end of the pew before her a folded church bulletin. It had a small smudge upon it, greenish-grey, and the faint imprint of a circle where some bottle had been set. She reached out and then, because she could be as obedient as anyone, drew her hand back. "One did not touch things when death is upstairs." "Jane," Miss Hart whispered, "do you suppose it is one of ours?" "I think," said Miss Marple very mildly, "that it is always one of ours. Only sometimes we have not yet understood in what fashion. Up in the Belfry, there were murmurs and the careful sounds of people doing necessary but unpleasant tasks. Down below, the village began to tell itself the story in fragments. Mr. Kerr remembered that the bell ropes had been oiled that afternoon. Mrs. Clegg had seen a stranger in the lane, unless he was from the next village, in which case he may have been a cousin. Lady Eugenia was certain that no one of her household could be involved, which was always a useful certainty at the beginning of a tragedy. And in the midst of it, young George, who had set his honey by the wheat sheaves with such pride, whispered in a voice that did not know it had spoken. "We were 4 at the start. We should have been 5. Tom Welland turned sharply and hushed him, but Miss Marple had heard. She tucked away the number with the care she used for turning a heel. 5 ringers, and Mr. Bellamy absent with a fall, or so it was said. Then who else had been expected? Or perhaps more aptly, who had been hoped for? Her eye slid to the west door, which Tom had watched all evening, and to the empty space just inside it, where one might linger unnoticed, a place that smelt now faintly of peppermint and damp wool. Sergeant Barnes, who believed in processes, collected names with assiduity. He made notes and asked those tidy, respectful questions that yield more when the person believes the questioner is a little foolish. When he reached Miss Marple, he hesitated a fraction. "You are a visitor, ma'am?" "I am Jane Marple, staying with Miss Emmeline Hart at Rose Cottage," she returned pleasantly. "I am very sorry for the trouble." Barnes nodded, reassured by her calm, and was about to pass on when Miss Marple added in the same tone, as if remarking on the weather, "You might find it useful, Sergeant, to ask if anyone has recently purchased or borrowed liniment from the dispensary." "Liniment, ma'am?" "Yes," said Miss Marple, eyes mild. "A particular sort with a penetrating odour. Many people imagine its aroma means effectiveness. It can be very distracting in a close place." She smiled, almost apologetic. "I do hope I am not interfering." Barnes, who liked people who interfered in a way he could write down, thanked her and moved on. Miss Hart looked at her friend with a mixture of horror and admiration. "Jane, dear, you are too dreadful. You notice the most awful things." "Not awful," Miss Marple said, "only human. And as for dreadful, well, it is dreadful to be dead in a belfry. But if I have learned anything, it is that people seldom become dreadful all at once. It is more often the sort of thing that happens after a great many small, tidy decisions." The bells lay quiet on their ropes, mild as sleeping snakes. Above, the belfry kept its secret a little longer, while below the whispering wove the village into its own net. As the last light drained from the stained glass, and the chrysanthemums took on that pallor of flowers after sundown, Miss Marple allowed herself to think for the first time of the man above and of the exacting, sorrowful business that would follow. She observed, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world, that a pair of gloves had been set down upon the shelf near the tower door, gloves of kid, good quality, one slightly scuffed, the other surprisingly clean. They did not at first glance belong to any of the ringers. Later she would remember the gloves. For the moment she watched as Dr. Brent descended at last, slow and careful, and met Sergeant Barnes at the foot of the stair. The doctor's voice was low, but in a church one hears what one is not meant to, and the words that reached them, not long, settled like ash upon the harvest offerings. It was, Miss Marple thought, a poor start to a festival intended to thank Providence. But Providence, in her experience, required more from villages than good intentions and chrysanthemums. Providence required understanding of people, their small vanities and large fears, their gloves and liniments and the curious ways they rang their bells. She folded her knitting, which was now exactly at the place where the heel would turn, and waited. Sergeant Barnes, having collected as many names as his small notebook would admit, spoke quietly with the vicar, and then, lips set in that manner of men who have accepted an unpleasant duty, returned to the stair with Dr. Brent. The two went up together with a steady, unshowy tread. The nave took on that practical hush in which every small noise acquires significance. A scuff of leather, a nervous cough stopped halfway, the breath of flowers lifting beeswax and damp stone. Miss Marple did not move. She watched the bell rope sway once, twice, and fall still, like well-behaved serpents deciding against mischief. Lady Eugenia, who disliked untidy emotions unless they wore livery and answered to a whistle, began to distribute occupations. "Mr. Kerr, collect the hymn-sheets. Mrs. Pym, the dahlias must be moved from the draught. Jessie, water from the vestry, if you please." Jessie rose, uncertain on her feet, but obedient to authority that sounded kind. Tom Welland kept his hand upon George's shoulder, as if truth were a lively puppy and might slip the leash. "No talk," he said under his breath. "We wait." "Yes, father," the boy whispered, then added despite himself, Mr. Bellamy said he might stand, only stand. He wanted to. Tom's fingers tightened, a warning in the shape of affection. Mr. Cranch stood a little apart, hat in hand, jaw set in the expression grocer's reserve for troublesome eggs. He looked once at Lady Eugenia, once at the tower door, and then at the floorboards, as though accounts might be written there. Miss Marple, who noticed most things in the way that good housemaids notice dust, observed that he breathed through his mouth, and that his right hand, hidden in his pocket, pressed something flat and tinny into an awkward oval. Dr. Brent and the sergeant came down. The doctor asked for a blanket, the sergeant for a chair. Jessie, who had reached the vestry and seen nothing, returned with water nonetheless, as if usefulness could defend against remembrance. Barnes addressed the company with the careful phrases of a man setting chairs beneath a tottering shelf. "We'll take statements in the hall. No one to leave." He glanced at the vicar. "We'll close the tower after." His eyes, passing over Miss Marple, paused and went on in the embarrassed politeness one extends to a schoolmistress who might be marking one's manners. "The deceased is a man, middle-aged," Dr. Brent said, keeping his voice low. "Constrictive cause. Recently, within the hour, I believe." "Exact, not dramatic," Miss Marple approved. As the congregation arranged itself toward the hall, she allowed the others to flow round her, and with a motion that could not be called intruding by anyone except the already guilty, lifted the vestry curtain. Upon the little oak table lay a squat bottle with a torn label and a screw cap nicked by pliers. A damp ring stained the folded church bulletin beside it, a greenish halo such as liniment leaves when it sweats through its own intentions. The smell reached her, peppermint first, then camphor, then wintergreen, the cheerfulness of pain. "Leave the jug, Jessie, dear," said Miss Marple, gentle and therefore obeyed. "A damp cloth from the font will do better." Jessie, relieved to be commanded without scolding, bobbed and went where water has always been found. Miss Marple let the curtain fall back and walked sedately after the rest. The hall, trestles, uncompromising bulbs, flagstone floor, received the village like a ship's mess in bad weather. Tea was resolved upon with collective firmness that did not hasten the kettle. Barnes opened a new notebook and began. The vicar offered kindness and vagueness. Lady Eugenia offered precision and an offended competence. George Welland, when summoned, sat very straight. "Second bell," he said. "Father leads. Mr. Cranch the tenor. Dr. Brent the treble. We began at the quarter. Did you see Mr. Bellamy?" asked Barnes, blandly, as one asks after umbrellas. "No, sir." Colour climbed George's ears. "He said he might stand by. He's not right since the fall, sir." Said Barnes, writing in the patient way of men who expect truth to arrive late and improperly dressed. Tom's turn came. He spoke sparingly, as men do who have the habit of being believed. He had oiled the sallies at noon. George had helped. Mr. Bellamy had not appeared then. He had watched the west door during the ringing, yes, in case Mr. Daltrey came, he added, with the air of confessing to a vanity. He spoke of joining last week. Lady Eugenia inserted in the voice of a person correcting a footman's plate that Mr. Daltrey had written declining on account of an estate meeting. She produced this with just enough emphasis to prove she knew where meetings lived. Mr. Cranch's recital was neat and newly polished by worry. He had noticed the draught by the porch. It had been worse last Sunday. He had taken a lozenge for a tickle. He produced the tin. Miss Marple, who respects the evidence provided by small containers, saw a lid without scratches and a compartment without crumbs. "New tins, like new alibis, are very smooth, Dr. Brent," said Barnes, a shade more courteous. The doctor was economical. He had joined the ringers for neighbourliness. He had recently treated more than one villager for bruising. "Among them Mr. Bellamy?" "Among them," he admitted. "Can you identify the deceased?" "I should prefer to see Mr. Bellamy first," Dr. Brent replied. A reasonable answer, and therefore suspicious to the impatient. Barnes, who was not impatient, accepted it and wrote something that might have been the word later. Jessie, who had been quiet with the effort of being brave, raised a hand halfway and found herself heard. "Please, sir, there's a bottle in the vestry as smells like the doctor's rubs. Only stronger." Mrs. Pym started and protested that nothing left the cupboard without her knowledge. The keys were upon her person. Dr. Brent glanced toward the nave, curiosity breaking and then mending behind professional propriety. Barnes nodded. "We'll look when we've done." He wrote bottle and underlined it. The inventory of times and places continued. Had anyone lingered at the porch? Had anyone gone up the stair between Peel and him? Mr. Kerr, the organist, remembered, after a little rummaging in the attic of recollection, that Mr. Bellamy had mentioned a nephew who sometimes came to lend a hand. "A well-meaning youth," Mr. Kerr said, to whom youth had rarely been kind. "I regret I cannot be sure whether he is a Harold or a Henry." He smiled helplessly at his memory, which had always prided itself on names, and now failed at its favourite, occupation. Mrs. Clegg arrived with a plate of Welsh, cakes like flattened moons, and contributed an observation she had been polishing all evening. "You can tell a right shoulder from a left," she announced, tapping herself with satisfaction. "A man with a bad right will rub the embrocation there, and your whole pew will smell it." Now Mr. Bellamy's trouble was left. Broke it the year the ladder slipped. We all remember. She looked at Dr. Brent for confirmation in the manner of parishioners, asking a curate to bless something already blessed. "It has set," he said neutrally. Miss Hart winced at the word set applied to bones. Miss Marple allowed one thought to step forward and curtsy. "A right shoulder, then." The bottle ring on the bulletin. The way peppermint sits upon other smells like a polite aunt who has come to chaperone mischief. She asked, in the soft tone with which she inquired after grandchildren, whether George had set down any bottle while oiling the Sallies. "Only for a minute, ma'am," he said, appalled at the memory of being ordinary. "By the south pew. I tied my lace. I didn't spill." "Of course not," she murmured. "Spills are much rarer than people think. They require carelessness, and people are generally careful when they mean to be careless. By the time the kettle sulked its way to a boil, talk had loosened enough to show where it would not again. Miss Marple sifted it as one sifts flour, keeping the lumps. A new lozenge tin. A nephew with an obliging initial. A bottle in the vestry nobody owned. Gloves seen earlier upon a shelf that were no longer there. She added to her little hoard of oddments the quick doubt behind Tom Welland's eyes when the west door opened. Such doubts belong to either hope or dread, which are cousins. Barnes shut his book with a clap that was not unfriendly. "We'll pause. Doctor, lamps for the stair." He hesitated, then turned a fraction. "Miss Marple, anything I should notice?" "Only that dust is an honest gossip," she said, smiling as if at her own foolishness. "It never remembers to be discreet in two directions at once." Night had come down in the square, complete way of October. The tower stood against it like a sensible old soldier. As the hall emptied by courteous degrees, Miss Marple and Miss Hart took the path to the porch. The troublesome scent was thinner out here, more a recollection than a presence. Somewhere not far away, a latch lifted and fell with the secrecy of people who think privacy an answer to questions. Miss Marple paused at the west door. The little shelf by the umbrella stand was bare. "Gloves?" asked Miss Hart. "Removed," said Miss Marple, which is less interesting than when they were put there. They walked home with the measured pace appropriate to ladies and to thought. Rose Cottage had set a lamp like a promise. Miss Hart busied herself with cups. Miss Marple, contentedly still, listened to the kettle finding its courage. "You will not sleep," said Miss Hart. "I seldom do in a new village," Miss Marple returned, "until I know whether its sins are ordinary." She sipped and folded her hands. "There is always the person who means to be invisible, and the obliging other who attracts attention in their stead. Between those two a neat murderer can pass." "Do you think it is Mr. Bellamy?" Miss Hart asked, and then, as if apologizing to the dead, added, "Poor man." "I think," said Miss Marple, "that we are intended to think so. That is not the same as being correct. If it is Mr. Bellamy, the intention will be a truth. If it is not, the intention is a labour, and labour's fray. Peppermint is busy tonight, and Peppermint is rarely busy without purpose." She set down her cup and allowed the day to rearrange itself once more. A bottle nicked by pliers, a ring on a bulletin, a right shoulder emboldened by liniment, a new lozenge tin, a pair of gloves that decided against being evidence, the rope-end striking stone. People, in Miss Marple's experience, did not become dreadful all at once. They prepared themselves by small, tidy habits, and then one evening those habits did exactly what they had been practicing. "There will be talk," Miss Hart said. "There always is," Miss Marple agreed. "Best to let it stay where it belongs. The stare will tell Barnes more usefully than tongues. Some feet ascend with purpose and descend with invention. He will see which." Miss Hart shivered. "I wish the stare would speak in daylight." "Truths told at night are kinder," said Miss Marple. "In the morning people begin improving them." She smiled, small and certain. "Tomorrow I shall ask after a nephew called Harold or Henry or something equally helpful, and I shall be polite to liniment. It is astonishing what embrocation will confess if you treat it as a person." She rose, neat as a pin in her shawl, and went to her window. Outside, the village lay with its lids down, pretending to sleep and listening very hard. A fox barked somewhere with improper confidence. Miss Marple left the casement open a cautious inch to let the last of the peppermint away, and thought, before sleep stitched her evenly, of gloves, dust, shoulders, and bells, the quiet after-sound that proves a striking really happened, and that someone, somewhere, counted upon it. Morning arrived with the mannered innocence of a child told not to ask questions. Mist lifted from the hedges, and St. Anselm's Tower sat proper beneath a pale sky that pretended last night had been rehearsal for something else. Miss Marple rose early, her sleep as neat as her folded shawl, while Miss Hart set the kettle. "Lights at the vicarage past midnight," Miss Hart said. "Indigestion or diligence," Miss Marple replied, accepting tea. "I should like to fetch thread from the High Street," she added, "an errand that opens doors." By 9 the village had put on its face. Mr. Cranch's bell jingled with respectability. Miss Marple entered with a list capable of curtsying. Tea, the better china, bicarbonate, and, oh yes, lozenges. "My friend's chest is sentimental." "Plain or aniseed?" asked Mr. Cranch. "Aniseed is amiable," she said. "Do many prefer the other sort?" "Peppermint sells," he admitted, "but not to the choir. Mr. Kerr says they quarrel with the organ." He set a new tin on the counter, whose lid shone like a fresh alibi. "The tins have changed flatter," Miss Marple observed. "New supplier," said Mr. Cranch. "2 went at once yesterday, 1 to Mrs. Treadle for the hall, 1 to Mr. Bellamy's nephew. Came about 5. Called himself Harry Pike. Town shoes, village trousers?" Miss Marple asked. Mr. Cranch nodded. "And a shirt that had ironed itself and given up. Polite with small coins." She praised his accounts and went on. "The dispensary smelt of gentian violet and thrift. Liniment?" said Miss Tapley. "Hawes's household rub, or Dr. Brent's improved. The latter is stronger and must be used with intelligence." "Dr. Brent's?" Miss Marple chose. "You keep a mind for sales?" "We do. 2 bottles yesterday, 1 to the hall, Mrs. Treadle, 1 to a gentleman who asked whether the cap would be tight. I told him not to decant it. Character goes." Outside, thoughts settled like flour. The hall had lozenges and embrocation. Harry Pike had peppermint and opinions about caps. St. Anselm's lay on her way, as if it had arranged itself there. Sergeant Barnes kept company with a notebook and his dignity at the tower door. "Good morning, miss," he said. "Perhaps the dust has obliged you?" she asked. It has obliged someone. 2 sets of marks on the stair, 1 deep at the outer edge like a man in a hurry or carrying weight, 1 lighter, careful as a cat, a smear on the rail, oily. Doctor says liniment might account for it if a man rubbed his right shoulder and then steadied himself. Not daftness, Miss Marple said. Habit. The body does not consult the mind in corridors. We've identified him, Barnes added. Not Mr. Bellamy. Mr. Lionel Daltrey, Lady Eugenia's estate agent. Right shoulder trouble. Doctor thinks the drop too short for suicide, but we are to be cautious. Caution is a virtue, she said, except when it is a shroud. I'm for the hall, he told her. You will find sequence there, she returned, and possibly intention. The hall wore its brick like an old title. Mrs. Treadle received Miss Marple with curtsying competence. Yes, embrocation had come from Tapley's. Her ladyship's elbow suffered the wet autumn. Lozenges were for Mr. Kerr, because the choir would practice. Mr. Daltrey had business here yesterday? He was to attend at 4, miss, but did not. Last here Wednesday, accounts. Miss Marple was shown into a morning room that smelt faintly of orris and control. Lady Eugenia rose, composed as a ledger. If one must have a tragedy, she announced, one should manage it. Sergeant Barnes will wish to ask about Mr. Daltrey, Miss Marple said. He will be received. Daltrey had my confidence in trifles and my caution in matters of weight. Too eager to please, ruinous in a secretary. She looked toward the window where a gardener apologized to a shrub. He had a nephew. No, forgive me. That is Mr. Bellamy. Mr. Bellamy's nephew calls himself Harry Pike, Miss Marple offered. That youth, Lady Eugenia declared. Last week he proposed to modernize the bells by mechanical absurdity. I told him St. Anselm's required obedience, not invention. He laughed. People who laugh at the wrong time do so again at the right one. Was he here yesterday? Not here. He waited in the lane for Mr. Bellamy after luncheon. They conversed in that energetic way young men call civil. Then they went their ways. Gloves, Miss Marple said, as if remembering something domestic. Your ladyship does not mislay them? Never. If gloves were left at St. Anselm's, they belonged to someone with fewer rules. In the lane she met a young man whose shoes confessed London and whose trousers denied it. He lifted his hat with urbanity, still in its wrapper. Harry Pike, he said, you are Miss Marple. You came to see your uncle. I came to argue with him, he admitted. He is stubborn as a gate. I told him to leave the ringing till he mended. He told me to see to my own bells. An elegant joke, since I ring none. I bought peppermint because I smoke when vexed. And liniment? No, madam, I am still young enough to believe in sleeping badly instead. She noticed the nick upon his thumb, the sort pliers bequeath when lids prove obstinate. You asked Miss Tapley whether a cap would be tight, she said conversationally. I share rooms with a man who decants everything into jars, he replied, rueful. The habit is catching. I did not buy it. Untidiness varies, Miss Marple said, and let him go. She found Sergeant Barnes on the vicarage path, setting his questions in rows. Well, miss? Daltrey is our poor man, she said gently. He rubbed his right shoulder and bought no lozenges. The hall has new bottles and old habits. The nephew prefers jars and peppermint. Someone removed a pair of gloves that did not wish to be evidence. Your stare tells you who carried weight and who carried intention. Decide which was Daltrey. Barnes drew a careful line that might later become an opinion. And the other? Agile enough to be forgetful, Miss Marple replied. Watch for a man who remembers to be strong and forgets to be clumsy. And send for the bottle from the vestry before the choir comes. Busy people tidy other people's crimes. Afternoon slid toward practice with the stealth of respectable hours. Miss Marple went home by way of Mr. Bellamy's cottage. The gate creaked with the frankness of things not often opened. Mrs. Bellamy's sister kept the door like a chair against fainting. He is sleeping, she said. Dr. Brent forbade visitors and prescribed boredom. Is his nephew kind? Kind enough, she allowed. He mends things. Jars, mostly. On the kitchen shelf stood glass jars, and on a towel a newly washed one inverted. Beside it a screw cap with the teeth marks of pliers and a faint greenish rim. Miss Marple did not touch it. By the hour set for choir, St. Anselm's gathered itself as instructed. Mrs. Pym arranged duty into flowers. Mr. Kerr coaxed resignation from the organ. The ringers stood quieter than men should. Sergeant Barnes, with decent unobtrusiveness, lifted the vestry curtain and retrieved the squat bottle whose cap was nicked like a bitten coin. "For Dr. Brent," he murmured. "Before anyone improves it," Miss Marple agreed. The air retained the faint, officious brightness of peppermint. Miss Marple watched movement, who hesitated at the stair, who touched the rail with a left, and who with a right, who breathed as if climbing recalled something unpleasant. Tom Welland watched the west door. George studied rope-tails. Mr. Cranch opened a fresh lozenge with the caution of a man swallowing doubt. Dr. Brent, arriving late, flexed his hands once, and quietly chose a position that commanded both tower door and vestry. The first hymn unfurled. During the second verse, Jessie came from the belfry stair, pale but not undone. "There's a glove on the landing," she whispered to Miss Marple, because some people instinctively bring lost things to the right laps. "One? Only the one, left hand. Where the dust would print a careful man," Miss Marple murmured. Barnes looked to the stair. The practice paused without fuss. The glove lay where a person might rest before deciding, "Fine kid. Good. Quality," scuffed on the palm and dusted at the fingertips with the faintest bloom of greenish grey, as if it had pressed the mouth of a bottle. "Left," Barnes confirmed, holding it as one holds an accusation. "And its fellow?" "Gone." "Some people," Miss Marple said gently, "forget to finish what they mean to tidy." Her eyes slid to the ringers. One of them turned. His head at the first word glove. Not sharply, only with the reflex of a man who has misplaced something that ought not to betray him. The hymn ended on a note that pretended satisfaction, and the village, trying to be respectable, breathed again. Miss Marple, who did not pretend, felt the investigation take its next quiet step toward a person who had counted on the bells to drown more than sound. The tenor bell gave a faint answering shiver as the choir took breath again, a metal courtesy noticed by Miss Marple and, she thought, one other. She let the moment pass, allowing nerves to settle into habit, for habit reveals itself the next time it is trusted. She had no taste for theatrical accusations. She preferred the quiet embarrassment of facts aligning. If the glove's partner had been pocketed in haste, the hand that took it would soon miss its twin at some ordinary, inconvenient moment, reaching for a rail, a rope, or a latch polished by certainty. There. The third hymn began with a steadier confidence. Sergeant Barnes, with a discreet nod to Mrs. Pym, carried the recovered glove to the vestry and wrapped it in brown paper. Dr. Brent uncapped the squat bottle, touched a trace to his handkerchief, spoke briefly, and Barnes tied the parcel and set the bottle aside. When they came out, the bell ropes hung motionless. Practice dissolved without ceremony. People went out in clusters that pretended to be casual. Tom Welland set his hand upon George's shoulder and steered the boy home. Lady Eugenia paused to observe that the gate would stick unless planed. Barnes intercepted Miss Marple. "Doctor says the green could print on leather. Wintergreen and camphor with a breath of peppermint. By itself the smear proves nothing." "By itself," Miss Marple agreed. "Gloves tell one how a person means to be seen." "We found a trifle on the landing," Barnes added. "Corner of the rehearsal sheet, penciled L and meet at bell." "A sign to reassure the obedient," Miss Marple said. Dr. Brent, passing with his bag, offered. Daltrey initialed his arrangements. "Milk, timber, hedges." He went on, brisk but not hurried. In the morning Miss Marple attended to errands. At the grocer's she bought aniseed lozenges for Miss Hart. "Did Mr. Daltrey ever take peppermint?" she asked. "Not from me," said Mr. Cranch. "Tea for him, reckoning sort." Pike took peppermint yesterday. She thanked him and went on to Tapley's dispensary. Miss Tapley recalled her sales with ledger accuracy. Her ladyship's footman called at 3:30 for the rub. The gentleman who questioned the cap came at 5, looked, declined. Miss Marple turned along the lane toward Bellamy's cottage. The kitchen smelt of boiled cloth. Mrs. Bellamy's sister admitted her. 2 jars shone on a towel. Beside them lay pliers, nicked in one jaw. Nearby an upside-down screw cap bore a faint green ring. "My brother-in-law cannot open anything without wrecking it," the sister confessed. "He grips with the pliers. May I borrow the pliers?" The sister consented. On her way back she met Sergeant Barnes near the vicarage. "Doctor will write his composition," Barnes reported. "Says the green proves only that the bottle is his." "Writing fixes men to their choices," said Miss Marple. "And you?" "I thought to look into Daltrey's rooms. I shall come." Daltrey's lodging above the drapers smelled of soap. The landlady surrendered a box of papers. Inside were rents and a page entitled 4-acre proposed disposition, suggesting plots to relieve the estate and employ local men, with a penciled question, "Health house near school?" 4-acre abuts Welland's hives, Barnes observed. A road there would stir up bees and talk. Another sheet proposed repairs to the bell-frame, and at the bottom a line likely borrowed from Harry Pike. "Consider mechanical assistance. Custom to be preserved." They left with the landlady's blessing, which sounded like a complaint. On the stair, Miss Marple paused. "If you wished to make a strong man clumsy, Sergeant, what would you do?" "Blind him," Barnes said. "Or hurry him." "Hurry, yes," Miss Marple said. "Or perfume him so he thinks of himself instead of his feet." Barnes nodded. "Peppermint?" Evening returned the village to itself. Miss Hart pressed a sandwich upon Miss Marple. "You have your look," she said. "I should like to place a small temptation where it can do good." At the church gate, Miss Marple explained it to Barnes. The glove, left hand to be said by Mrs. Pym, to be sent to the vestry for cleaning in the morning, the key to remain with Barnes. "People who have lost a thing they dare not claim," she said, "often try to steal it back before it is improved." At dusk they took up observation in the churchyard. Presently footsteps approached, the even tread of a man who believes in keys. Dr. Brent emerged from shadow, set his hand on the vestry door. "Doctor," Barnes said. "Sergeant," he returned. "Mrs. Pym sent word the blankets were wanted for laundering. I came to unlock." "Blankets stay till morning," Barnes answered. Dr. Brent went away unhurried. They waited through the last of the light. When the moon was a pale saucer, a quieter sound came, the soft pad of rubber soles. A figure, not tall, moved along the wall with the awkward grace of men who have taught themselves to be unobserved. It tried the door, found it firm, and reached up toward the little window where air is admitted and secrets sometimes escape. Fingers, unconfident, right-handed, tested the latch. "Good evening, Mr. Cranch," said Barnes. The grocer started like a till not catching, and produced an explanation as he invented it. "Mrs. Pym asked me to see if the draft troubled the hymn books." "Mrs. Pym sends no one to windows in the dark," Miss Marple said. Mr. Cranch wilted into honesty. "I lost a glove," he confessed. "I thought it might have fallen in the vestry among the umbrellas." "I did not like to knock. People talk. They always do," Miss Marple said. Barnes, who knew the difference between guilt and mortification, dismissed him with a warning about latches. When he had gone, they waited a little longer, and were rewarded only by a fox's opinion of property law. Barnes relocked the door and pocketed the key. "We have learnt who is not bold," said Miss Marple, "and how a stain travels. Mr. Cranch will have green upon his right cuff by morning, if he keeps his glove in his pocket, with the handkerchief he used upon his nose." "Will it help us?" asked Barnes. "It will help us not to arrest a grocer," she said. "And we have learnt something else. The person we seek believes places know him. He will expect the vestry to open because it usually does for him." They parted at the gate. Miss Hart's lamp drew Miss Marple home. "Useful?" Miss Hart asked. Very, said Miss Marple. Tomorrow I shall ask Lady Eugenia what 4-Acre has done to offend her, and I shall inquire whether Harry Pike carries pliers for jars. People who decant rubs often decant other people's patients. Somewhere there is a lid whose teeth marks match a habit. She let the day arrange itself. A bottle nicked by pliers, a cap with a green ring, a left glove that had touched a mouth not meant for it, a boy with jars and a man with plans, a doctor who did not hurry, and a grocer who could not knock, a penciled L that reassured someone who ought to have been wary. In villages, vanity meets necessity, and they compromise upon accidents. But accidents have the wrong smell. This one smelt of peppermint, because someone wanted courage to look like cleanliness. And courage bought by scent leaves a tidy mess for those who look where dust remembers. She slept lightly as sparrows do, listening for the small noises crimes make when they settle, and counting knitting, the steps to morning. Morning gathered itself with the tidy discretion villages prefer when ugly work must go on. Miss Marple, neat in a plain hat, told Miss Hart she would call first at the hall and then on Mr. Bellamy. Between the two, she said, something that wished to be forgotten will remember itself. Miss Hart gave her a paper parcel of aniseed as decent camouflage, and wished the day would be reasonable. Lady Eugenia received her in a room that had been combed of sentiment. Sergeant Barnes had just departed. His politeness lingered like a bookmark. The sergeant demands my accounts, Lady Eugenia announced. He shall have them. Daltrey was zealous for improvements the estate cannot afford. Zeal is a poor cashier. Miss Marple, who enjoyed hearing what people called virtues when they were angry with them, said mildly, he had a plan for the 4-Acre. It would have put men to work. It would have put creditors to laughter, Lady Eugenia returned. I told him to collect his papers after evensong. He did not come. If scandal exists here, it is arithmetic, not romance. Did Mr. Daltrey wear gloves? Miss Marple asked, as if about napkins. He gloried in bare hands, Lady Eugenia said with faint contempt. He thought gloves a form of hypocrisy. Then the pair at St. Anselm's are not his, Miss Marple observed. Lady Eugenia inclined her head. Tell the sergeant I will subscribe toward the bell frame when the parish shows sense. We will not be mechanized by boys with drills. She looked as if the bells themselves would obey her if asked nicely. On the gravel, Miss Marple met Dr. Brent, walking with professional moderation. He raised his hat. His left hand showed lean and competent, a touch abraded at the knuckles. Mr. Bellamy is quieter when required, he said. Your pliers should carry a warning. Menaces teach, Miss Marple replied. You have had a moving morning. Busier than I deserve, he answered, and passed on, sunlight finding a pale crescent at his wrist where a glove would have sat. It was a trifle, and Miss Marple stored it with other trifles that eventually take a vote. Harry Pike was at Bellamy's gate with a jar whose lid he had drilled for air. Inside, a fly battered the glass as if determined to improve it. Engineering, he said cheerfully. You can govern a hammer to strike like a hand. Traditions tolerate hinges when treated kindly, Miss Marple returned. He coloured and let her pass. Inside, the kitchen smelt of boiled cloth. 2 jars dried lip down on a towel. Beside them lay pliers with nicked jaws and a screw cap with the faintest greenish halo. Harry puts everything safe in jars, Mr. Bellamy's sister said. He cannot bear a bottle to have its way. And peppermint? Asked Miss Marple. He hates it. Says it makes quacks smell respectable. Miss Marple left with one certainty folded as neatly as a linen. At the lich gate, Sergeant Barnes met her. Doctor's report, he said. Manual pressure. Rope as afterthought. Drop too short to do more than bruise. Liniment on the rail in 2 places. Hand height and sleeve. Daltrey's cuffs clean. His hands soap, not wintergreen. I've sent the glove to the county. It may return with a compliment about nothing. Chemistry is a polite footman, Miss Marple said. Best employed when the door is already ajar. Barnes accepted this as encouragement and walked with her to the square. I have twice comforted myself foolishly, he confessed. First with suicide, then with a grocer at a window. Errors that make a man honest are useful, Miss Marple said. The vicar, borrowing Sunday's courage, announced that parishioners might look into the tower from below. They came in steady curiosity. Miss Marple watched bodies admit what faces tried to forget. Tom Welland touched the rail with the fond economy of habit. George tried to keep his hands in his pockets and failed. Mr. Cranch breathed peppermint borrowed from another man's tin. Dr. Brent arrived last, looked briefly up the stair, and remarked to no one in particular, "There's always a turn where the air changes." "And careful men stumble," Miss Marple added. He glanced, then was professional again. Toward evening, Jessie, patient as good help always is, found the right-hand glove lodged behind parish magazines in the hymn-book cupboard. Barnes lifted it with paper and set it beside its fellow. It was more scuffed, and at the wrist a dull crescent of wax had printed itself, as if a gloved hand had leaned upon polished wood for one counting breath. "Someone cleaned in a hurry," Miss Marple said, "and forgot the shelf no one thinks of." "Whose?" asked Barnes. "Someone who must look a gentleman even alone," she answered. "A real one stains less theatrically." She looked at the pale bell ropes. "If you'll allow Miss Hart to pour tea for the ringers at Rose Cottage, memory will remember." Tea arranged itself around thick cups and a cake that forgave second helpings. Tom and George came with honest discomfort, Mr. Cranch with duty, Harry Pike with a tie that meant endeavour, Dr. Brent with warmth that could not decide where to sit. Miss Marple asked about bees and cordage, about frames and whether a bell is more a loom than a gate. She left spaces for silence to work. George filled one, as boys do. "Mr. Daltrey told me he'd meet at Bell before rehearsal," he blurted, then looked at his father. Tom's hand on his shoulder steadied truth. "I waited at the west door," Tom admitted. "He never came that way. When George called, I went in." "Did you pass anyone on the stair?" "No." He hesitated. "There was a smell, like sweets from a chemist, only sharper." "Wintergreen pretending to be peppermint," Miss Marple said. Dr. Brent's cup met its saucer very softly. If a man rubbed his right shoulder and steadied himself at the rail, Miss Marple continued in a tone that might have been about mending, another following would trust the stair. "A short drop is treacherous. 2 hands are quicker. Afterwards the rope is persuaded to tell the wrong story. No one looked at anyone." The seed cake approved of tact by falling apart politely. Harry Pike tried a laugh. "If I owned kid gloves, they'd perish in my jars." "They would," Miss Marple agreed. "Mr. Cranch keeps knitted ones in a drawer. Tom wears none. George has a pair for Sundays and forgets them. We are left with gentlemen or rehearsal for the part." Dr. Brent rose, not offended, only older. "Miss Marple, I'll take the lane." "Do," she said amiably. "It gives thoughts the right to speak." He bowed and went. After the door had shut, Miss Hart said, "You stir the pot without boiling it." "There is no use in curdling people," Miss Marple replied. She cleared cups with that economy that keeps thought neat. "In the morning I shall borrow a ladder and look at the gallery rail. If the crescent is altar wax, it will confess. If glove-dressing, it will sulk. People who distrust theatricals betray themselves by choosing the wrong props." Tonight, Miss Marple did not borrow a ladder. She borrowed consent. In the morning, she presented herself at St. Anselm's with a ball of string and the manner of a woman rescuing hymn numbers. Mr. Kerr produced the step-stool for the gallery and a cloth that had seen honest service. Sergeant Barnes arrived with a pencil behind his ear, apparently by accident and in fact by arrangement. "If a lady examines dust," he said, "it is my duty to bear witness." Miss Marple tested the wobble of the stool and went up. The crescent on the gallery rail waited like a small truth. She touched it with the clean edge of the cloth, and at Mr. Kerr's candle pressed the cloth to a warmed saucer. It softened, not as altar wax does, but into a tacky shine with a faint oily breath. "Glove dressing," she said. "Church wax melts politely. this sulks and smears. Barnes regarded the rail and the turn in the stair. So our right glove leaned here, he said, and the left, having comforted a shoulder, printed lineament upon paper. Appearances are a habit, Miss Marple replied. Some men are never alone, even when no one watches. Why choose the Belfry? Barnes asked. To be heard, Miss Marple answered. Bells make a public notice, and a short drop provides a story. They descended. In the porch a narrow man waited, cap in hand. Pike sent me, he said, giving his name as Carr, a mechanic from the next town. About striking gear. Young Mr. Pike reckons a retrofit could be done cheaply. Barnes took his card and asked whether Pike had visited the Belfry with him. Only to look, Carr said. Day before yesterday. He called the frame elderly but honest. We looked and went. Barnes proposed they speak again with Mr. Daltrey's landlady. Mrs. Prynne received them at the top of her polished stairs. She surrendered 2 unpaid slips, one for kid gloves from the draper, one from a laundry that returned cuffs like policy. He loved tidy edges, she admitted, but he never kept a pair 2 weeks, always mislaying, left or right. Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Prynne considered. Right, she decided. He wrote with the left and carried parcels with the right. Gloves go where hands go. The dead man's hands were bare, Barnes said on the way down. So our glove is not his? No, Miss Marple said. It belongs to someone who wished to look official while doing a private thing. Near noon, Lady Eugenia's footman brought a note on thick paper that insisted upon being obeyed. Her ladyship proposed to assist propriety by opening Daltrey's office cupboard in Sergeant Barnes's presence. They examined 2 deeds, a rolled plan of 4 acre and a folder of correspondence. One letter, unsigned and cut from common paper, advised Daltrey to let be, and remember he was paid to maintain, not reform. Another, initialed L, set a time, evensong speak at bell before rehearsal. Lady Eugenia looked on as at a committee. Daltrey had the zeal of a curate and the arithmetic of a poet, she said. They lunched at Rose Cottage on sandwiches that respected the bread. Miss Hart said, Dr. Brent called to ask after your ladder. He recommends I leave climbing to men, Miss Marple supplied. He does, Miss Hart agreed. He carried gloves, kid dark, and put them in his hat when he took tea. I fetched them when he left them. He smiled as if I had rescued dignity. In the afternoon the village rehearsed grief by shopping. At the post office a wire from the county laboratory arrived. The smear upon the left glove was wintergreen, and camphor consistent with strong embrocation. The crescent at the cuff was wax dressing. No blood. Chemistry keeps its head, Barnes said. They went to Bellamy's cottage. Mr. Bellamy, propped and peevish, announced he would return to the tower out of spite. Let the bells beat sense into men, he grumbled. Which doctor? Miss Marple asked gently. Which is there? He retorted. Hawes would have told me to be wicked and rest. Trent tells me to be good and rest, which is worse. On the dresser, a cleaned jar stood lip down beside a screw cap with a faint green halo. The nicked pliers lay next to them. Did Mr. Daltrey call lately? Miss Marple asked. Bellamy's sister answered. Tuesday, to ask how many men the Bells wanted for safety. He said he was building costs and sense into a plan. Outside, Harry Pike overtook them with an eager scheme about pulleys. You were in the Belfry the day Mr. Bellamy fell, Barnes said. Under it, Harry returned. I heard the slip. I said rails and pride dislike speed. He said stairs and youth dislike advice. His right thumb bore a healing nick. From jars? Miss Marple asked. From a paint tin, he said, rueful. You handle pliers neatly, she observed. I grew up with tins that hated me, he said. Evening pressed the hedges smooth. The choir met. The ringers did not. The village breathed as people do when they expect polite thunder. Miss Marple took a place near the west door with her knitting. Sergeant Barnes stood somewhere he could be overlooked. Dr. Brent arrived late, gloves in hand, and went first to the vestry, then to the tower door. He paused at the rail, laid the right glove upon it and rubbed his shoulder under his coat. After evensong, Barnes asked the doctor to join them in the vestry. Dr. Brent examined the returned glove, the sealed bottle, the copied letters. The left glove printed "Rub because I patted my handkerchief after attending Mr. Bellamy," he said. "The rail dressing is mine. Vanity, there is no merit in denying it. I did not kill Daltrey. I am perfectly willing you did not," Miss Marple said. "I would only like to understand who arranged for you to look as if you might." Barnes nodded. "Who benefits by Daltrey's silence? Who needed the Belfry because he cannot argue in a drawing room?" "Someone who believes the parish his mirror," Miss Marple said. The church emptied to the murmur of chairs that knew their places. Outside, Lady Eugenia's car waited. She entered with the confidence of a person who never meets a closed door. "Sergeant, have you done with my name?" she asked. "Entirely," Barnes said. "I require your authority now, not your alibis." "Good," she returned. "Inform the village that I subscribe to the bell frame, and oblige yourself by arresting whoever has turned my church into a theatre." When she had gone, Miss Marple smiled. "One must admire management," she said. "Tomorrow," Barnes said, "I will ask Mr. Kerr for the choir's pencil tin and Mrs. Prynne for a right glove mended twice at the thumb. And I will ask Harry Pike to show me the paint tin that cut him. And you, ma'am?" "I shall ask the bells," she replied. "How many hands pull when two hands pretend to be one?" They parted in the porch. The tower kept its old patience, waiting for the moment when patience ceases to be a virtue and becomes proof. Sergeant Barnes kept his appointment with method. At 10 he came to the choir vestry with Mr. Kerr's pencil tin and a bundle of old rehearsal sheets, tied with faded string. Miss Marple examined the pencils, church issue and blunt, and compared the corner note and L with "Meet at Bell" to Daltrey's plans lent by Mrs. Prynne. Daltrey's L began firm on the base and rose squarely. This one looped from above like a flourish learned to impress. "He did not write his own summons," Barnes said, pleased to be exact. "Someone wore his initial as a badge," Miss Marple agreed, and chose a place where the writer knew every handhold. Mr. Kerr, summoned, dignified his pencils. "Anyone may take one and put it back," he said. "They return by conscience and accident. I make L's like pews, not loops." He coloured at the scrap as a man does when a small thing in church is wrong. Barnes closed the tin. He turned the tin in his hands a moment, considering the smallness of things that move larger ones. Next, Mrs. Prynne's glove. Mrs. Prynne produced a brown paper parcel and a look that forgave policemen nothing. Inside lay a right-hand glove mended twice at the thumb. "Mr. Daltrey left it yesterday to darn," she said. "He wore his hands bare." "So our kid pair is not his and the note is not his," Barnes said. "Prestige and signature borrowed. Borrowed things never quite fit. They rub at the edges until someone notices. So with names." "And scent," Miss Marple added. They went to the tower. Tom Welland and George were measuring a frayed Sally. Chalk showed where rope ends touched stone. "Mr. Welland," said Barnes, "how would one steady a body and pull a rope at once?" Tom's honest face contracted. "You wouldn't, not alone. You'd set and stand or call a second. The pull wanted here is not tidy work. Alone you'd do it clumsily." "Then we should expect tidying after," Miss Marple said, "by a man who cannot bear mess." They raised a bell an inch and let it breathe. The rope answered with a whisper of hemp. "If Mr. Daltrey stood here," George said, "a man behind could take him by surprise." "From the right," Tom added, "if his shoulder was sore and he held the rail." Barnes nodded. "Liniment at hand height on the right flank of the rail, and a bottle in the vestry with the doctor's formulation. The cap is nicked with pliers." "What matters is not the owner at breakfast," Miss Marple said, "but the hand that carried it at evensong." They crossed to Tapley's dispensary. Miss Tapley, brisk, produced her ledger. 3:30, Hall liniment. 5 o'clock, gentleman asked about the cap, did not buy. Then Mr. Kerr for Polish, Mr. Welland for string. 7, Dr. Brent for bandages. "Describe the gentleman," said Barnes. "Neat in a hurry. City collar, country shoes." Harry Pike, Miss Marple decided. Miss Tapley allowed it might be. But he says he did not buy, Miss Marple added. He did not, Miss Tapley said. He turned the cap and put it back as if resisting an unkindness. In the lane they met Pike, cross with a folded drawing. He softened at sight of the sergeant. "If you want accuracy, you must treat Wood like a witness," he said. "You were at the dispensary," Barnes observed. "Looked, left it," Pike answered. "Doctor's orders. I waited in the porch, went home for a file, came back to bells and alarm." His dismay was unperformed. Miss Marple left it alone. By afternoon the village had composed itself. Barnes and Miss Marple met Dr. Brent at the lich gate with the county reply. He had the careful composure of men who spend their days between pain and patience. "No blood, no useful prints," he said. "The residue is mine. The cap bears plier marks. Whoever opened it used force from habit." "Bellamy's habit," Barnes said. "And Pike's," Miss Marple added. "Without opportunity, habit is only a story." They asked Mr. Kerr about polish. He produced a small bottle. "I wipe rails when no one else remembers," he said. "Do you polish the gallery?" Miss Marple asked. "When knees agree," he said. "Yesterday they did not." On their way out, Miss Marple paused by the west door where late sun printed the stone. A faint arc of dressing shone on the stone. She touched it with her glove. "We have one fact more," she told Barnes on the path. "Whoever leaned with his right hand did so before the body was found, and again after. The rail and the flagstone both carry fresh dressing. A gentleman paused here to collect himself, leaving by the west door when the vestry was already in commotion. That is tidiness after clumsiness." Barnes looked from door to tower. "He left, remembered a glove, went back, failed to find the left and hid the right in the magazine cupboard, and returned the next night to retrieve the other and found the door locked," Miss Marple said. "Only our window tester was Mr. Cranch. He borrows, he does not kill." They went to Rose Cottage because thought like tea improves in a proper cup. Miss Hart poured. "Every time you return," she told Miss Marple, "you bring 3 small facts and 1 larger calm. We have a hand that writes other men's initials, a rail that keeps a gentleman's secrets, a bottle with plier marks, and a body lured by the word improvement," Miss Marple said. "What we need is the thing Pride forgot." "And that is?" asked Barnes. "Bell will tell you when 2 hands pull and 1 pretends to be 2, she said. "Tonight ask Tom to raise and set as if 4 men were 5. I shall listen." The rehearsal was arranged as a kindness to a curious lady and a test for the sergeant. Tom set 3 ringers where 5 should have been, with Harry Pike taking a rope under instruction, and Mr. Kerr counting changes sotto voce. The tower hummed with orderly effort. Harry missed his catch twice, and recovered with an embarrassed grin. Miss Marple sat in the nave, eyes on the falling sallies, ears on the lag and catch that betray more than hands admit. It came faint but decisive, a doubling on the tenor where 1 man made 2 pulls too close. When they set, she thanked them and looked across the quiet church to Dr. Brent, who had come late and listened in the porch. He returned the look without alarm, and with the interest of a man who likes to be thought of. "One hears what one listens for," she told Barnes at the door. "Our murderer is a neat man who hates mess, writes other men's letters, and tidies after clumsiness. He knows bells enough to fake assistance, but not enough to respect their pauses. He will have argued with Daltrey in words like duty and proportion. Tomorrow ask Mr. Welland to gather the ringers and Mr. Kerr to set hymn numbers. We will oblige a very polite confession." "Do you name him?" Barnes asked quietly. "I invite him," Miss Marple said. "He will name himself when his glove goes looking for its pair in front of people who know the difference between polish and dressing." The tower settled. Night took back the windows. Outside the air had a medicinal cleanness. Miss Marple slept less well and more usefully, and woke with the order of thanks, and the order in which one would be caught. Barnes kept his word, and the notice for a quiet safety run-through appeared with the hymn numbers. By late afternoon, St. Anselm's held the attentive hush of places used to being consulted. The ringers came. Mr. Kerr minded the hymn-board. Jessie set a tray on the porch. Miss Marple arrived with her knitting bag. Sergeant Barnes met her at the west door. "Plain and proper," he murmured. "Set, raise, stand, lower. Ask Habit a simple question and it answers," Miss Marple said. The church filled by village increments. Lady Eugenia, Mr. Cranch, Harry Pike, Tom Welland and George, Dr. Brent Lastgrave. He carried his hat in his left hand and his right glove in the other, the left already on. Barnes spoke in the tone reserved for ladders. "We'll show how to steady a man on the stair and how ropes are handled if someone goes faint." Tom arranged his men. Harry eager took a light rope. Mr. Cranch was excused and pleased. Miss Marple sat 3 pews back where one sees hands without seeming to. A brown paper parcel lay in her bag. After the first set, before the second, she rose with the apologetic air of a woman asking a favor of people already dutiful. "One thing," she said to Mr. Kerr, "I found several gloves in the vestry cupboard while tidying. They have been cleaned and put in paper. Owners may reclaim them." She laid the parcel on the pew end, a knitted mitten, George's gauntlet, and a pair of kid, dark, newly dressed. No one moved at once. Then Mr. Cranch, crimson with honesty, recovered the knitted article. George laughed and claimed his gauntlet. Lady Eugenia's eye passed over the kid pair with contempt. Harry Pike kept his hands in his pockets. Dr. Brent, who had been speaking under his breath to Barnes, turned in that casually belated way of men accustomed to leeway. He glanced down, measured the array, and with a small practical motion picked up the kid pair. He did not try them on. He laid them in his hat. "That is tidy," Miss Marple said gently. "Tidy sometimes arrives a trifle early." Dr. Brent looked at her. "No alarm, only patience. If there is to be a demonstration, let it be done." He stepped to the tower door. They did it again. Tom called. The Sallies breathed, the bell mouths answered. Miss Marple felt the rhythm settle. Then on the tenor, that same slight doubling, the close tidy surplus where one hand pretends to be two. It came and went in a moment. Too neat to repeat by accident. Barnes raised a hand. The ropes fell still. "Doctor," he said respectfully, "for instruction, show the right way to steady a faint man on the stair." "Gladly," said Dr. Brent, and mounted. His right hand took the rail at the turn where Wintergreen had taught its lesson. "You come below and support at the hips," he said. It might have contented everyone if Miss Marple had not added, mild as a reminder about collars, "And if the faint man has just rubbed his right shoulder with strong liniment, ought the glove be on or off?" To her small laugh, Jessie, ashamed of herself, and a smaller silence while people counted what they had seen. Dr. Brent's right glove lay in his hat. His left was on his hand. "It would print the right," Dr. Brent said evenly. "I have taken my right glove off. I dislike grease." "That is what I mean," Miss Marple returned. "Tidiness that arrives before necessity." Barnes did not hurry. "Doctor," he said, "you came late last night and first tonight to the vestry. The bottle is your make. The rail bears dressing where your hand rests. The note that brought Mr. Daltrey to the bell. Who wrote it?" "A person who ought not to," Dr. Brent said. "Not I." "Looped L's are made by men who learn to please," Miss Marple said. "Agents and clerks, Mr. Daltrey wrote square. The loop was preference." Harry Pike, kneading his cap, said, "I can copy an L. I didn't write that one." "I know," she said. "You copy enthusiasm better than penmanship." Tom cleared his throat. "If the person meant us to think Daltrey hanged himself, why not leave him proper?" "Because proper takes practice," Miss Marple said. A short drop and a slow rope made a picture quickly. Lady Eugenia's patience took the chair. "Motive, Miss Marple." Miss Marple looked at the west door where dressing had printed a crescent on stone. "Mr. Daltrey had 2 schemes. You dismissed one, the bell frame. The other was the 4-acre plan. A small health house by the school, where mothers might bring children and accounts kept against visits. Medicines dispensed in daylight. It would have made the doctor beloved and observable. It would also have paired private earnings. A movement went through the nave like a thought changing its mind. Dr. Brent stood still. Mr. Daltrey discovered something tiresome. Not monstrous, fees set against visits perhaps not strictly made, and a stronger liniment sold under another name. Miss Marple continued. Enough to spoil a young reputation. He was tidy. He would have spoken privately first. He chose the bell because he believed men more honest when the church listens. And why should I bring my own bottle and gloves? Dr. Brent said, exact rather than angry. And write in another hand? And do it in my workplace? Because, Miss Marple said, you are a tidy man who hates mess and thinks arranging it is the same as avoiding it. You meant a quick scene to be pitied and put away. You counted on peppermint for courage and on habit for silence, and you had not practiced the bells. It nearly ended there. Vanity kept it from doing so. Dr. Brent turned to Barnes. She's wrong about motive, he said, precise. Daltrey meant to dismiss me to cheapen the estate's contract and bring back Hawes on terms. He told me so. I answered once. He answered, less fairly. By dropping weight into your hands, Miss Marple said. Dr. Brent's breath went out as if a bell had struck. I steadied him. He pushed. He was not a coward. He preferred a gesture to a conversation. I set the rope. Barnes closed his notebook. Dr. Lucas Brent, he said quietly, I'll ask you to come with me. Dr. Brent nodded and looked at Jessie. Mind the blankets, he said. They'll scorch if dried against the boiler. Then to Miss Marple, with a courtesy that had not yet learnt how to fail neatly, you are right about practice. I thought bells were merely heavy. They are that, Miss Marple said, and honest. He went down the aisle. The village did what villages do when a scene is over. It improved the story without meaning to. Lady Eugenia sat. Tom's arm found George's shoulder. Mr. Cranch examined his conscience. Harry Pike, who had been whistling without sound, found that sound had returned. Miss Marple tied the brown paper, folded it into her bag, and thought, with sorrowful exactness, tidy men make untidy crimes, and bells, when asked, tell who is pulling and who is pretending. They always do. The village exhaled in the way of places that think noise itself to be guilt. Barnes led Dr. Brent away without display, and people arranged their faces into versions suitable for the lane they were about to take. Miss Marple remained in her pew a moment longer, not from piety, but to let the displacement settle. When she rose, Jessie was there already with a broom she did not need. Will they hang him? Jessie whispered, ashamed of the word. No, Miss Marple said, because that was not the shape she had seen on the stair. But the truth will sit closely with him for a long while, which is worse for tidy men. Jessie nodded, the way good girls nod when the dust is under the rug and cannot be got at. Outside, the evening had not yet put its hand upon the hedges. Tom and George walked ahead, the boy with his head half turned as if conversation might be called back and made kinder. Mr. Cranch took the long way, a man retracing in his body every step his mind had made. Harry Pike lingered, caught between eagerness and shame. Miss Marple, passing him, said only, It is a mercy, Mr. Pike, that bells prefer honesty over modern improvements. We shall try to deserve them. He looked relieved at being given a task that was not reconstruction. Barnes returned after the formalities, took off his hat in the porch, and sat down with Miss Marple as if with a ledger. He says Daltrey came at him, pushed for effect, slipped for reality. He steadied, and then, as he put it, made it look like despair. He is clear on that. He is less clear on why Daltrey was at the bell at all. Men rarely are clear on the errands other people set them, Miss Marple said, especially when those errands are written in borrowed hands. Barnes tapped his notebook. We must account for the letter that began our evening. I do not like untidy threads. Nor I, Miss Marple said, and yet I prefer to keep them for mending. You have noticed, Sergeant, how often people write like their positions. Clerks loop to please because they have pleased since school. Officials square their letters as if they were building corners. Daltrey's L went up from the base like a candlestick. The note's L came down as if curtsying. A woman? Possibly. Or a man who lives by the approval of a woman. There is also the question of paper. Common, yes, but common paper is not shared in common places. The vicarage keeps cream, the hall thick with a crest. Daltrey ruled. Taproom a greasy sort. I should like to see the hall's blotter. You won't find the note, Barnes said. No, Miss Marple agreed, but one learns much from the ghost of an intention. They walked up to the hall while the day still had a decent excuse to be abroad. Lady Eugenia received them with organized patience. If this is a call of condolence upon the reputation of my parish, she said, you may be brief. I have sent for a locum. We will put the matter right publicly and privately. Barnes, who had rejected alibis a quarter of an hour earlier and now required authority, bowed. We are grateful for your subscription, my lady. We have one small housekeeping question, the writing table in Mr. Daltrey's office. May we see it? Of course. I have locked it, which is more attention than he ever gave it. She led them to the little office off the morning room, unlocked a neat drawer, and stood aside. Miss Marple did not touch the papers. She went to the blotter. Its leather was new. The paper on it was not. She lifted the top sheet gently and lowered it against the light from the window. Shadows rose, half-phrases, dates, the beginning of a column of sums. Near the bottom, a bolder stroke had left a clear reverse. An initial L like a ribbon and the word meat, with the tail of the T extended as if underlining good sense. Below that, Bell, written in a hand pressing so hard that the downstroke of B had bitten the paper. Pray do not make a melodrama of stationery, Lady Eugenia said coolly. Daltrey wrote all day. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed. So did someone who borrowed his place for her own words. Lady Eugenia looked at her, not angry but affronted by what she judged a discourtesy to grammar. If you have a charge, make it to Sergeant Barnes. If you have a suspicion, keep it to your friends. My suspicion, Miss Marple said, is that you sent to Mr. Daltrey the instruction he would respect, to meet at the Bell before rehearsal. You meant only to insist, in the only parish you fully own, that business be separated from drawing-room. You would not have him speak to you as if you were an employee among his plans. Lady Eugenia's chin lifted a degree. I will not be arranged, she said. If I set a meeting place that suited the village and not myself, I consider it philanthropy of the first water. And if I chose plain paper so the parish would not be dragged into my handwriting, I call it thrift. She paused, not to seek a defense, but to oblige them to recognize the adequacy of what she had said. I did not anticipate a murder, she added, with frost where regret might have melted things, nor did I intend to share my household's blotter with Mr. Daltrey's enthusiasms. He had too many of the latter and not enough of the former. It is not a crime, Barnes said carefully, to appoint an awkward place to talk. It is, Miss Marple said with equal care, a habit that courts mischief when pride is in attendance. She turned slightly to Jessie, who had appeared in the doorway with a tea-tray and the invincible expression of servants during a police visit. Jessie, dear, did you deliver a note on Friday? I was sent to Mr. Daltrey's rooms with an envelope, Jessie admitted. Her ladyship said, put it where he cannot miss it, and do not let Mrs. Prynne look over your shoulder. So I put it under the sugar bowl on his tray, and Mrs. Prynne looked over my shoulder. I am sorry. There is no harm in being seen, Miss Marple said gently. When people are not seen, they become theatrical. Lady Eugenia accepted this like a verdict upon architecture, and turned to Barnes. If you propose to add my name to your file, do so with neatness. Put it under error of judgment where it belongs. I will not have my village learn cowardice, when what it must learn is steadiness. Barnes closed his notebook with the quietest sound Miss Marple had ever heard a policeman make. Your ladyship, he said, conceding the final word to the person likely to have taken it anyway. On the gravel, the air felt less medicinal. "You will not proceed against her," Miss Marple said, not in question. "No," Barnes returned. "The law does not love moral arithmetic." She set the scene. He furnished the action. He confesses. She will put the parish in good order until she can forget. The forgetting will take longer than she thinks. People who dislike melodrama rarely forget the plays they have sponsored, Miss Marple agreed. They only forbid them. They walked together as far as the square. Mr. Kerr met them at the gate with a basket of hymn books and a face made tidy by purpose. "I have counted," he said, "and set aside the stained ones. If I may, I will replace the paper in the blotter. There has been a great deal of underlining." "Do," Miss Marple encouraged. "Clean paper improves tempers." Mr. Kerr looked gratified at being useful in the right department. News travels in villages by the route of things that need to be fetched. By supper time everyone knew that Dr. Brent had gone with Sergeant Barnes because he had been too tidy in a place built to forgive untidiness twice a week. Everyone had an opinion on the advisability of writing letters in borrowed hands. And everyone agreed to be in church on Sunday because, as Mrs. Pym said, a lesson must have listeners. That evening Miss Hart made cocoa as if medals might be awarded. "You have not finished," she said, with the privilege of friendship. "You are still looking at some small thing that is out of place." "Not out of place," Miss Marple said. "Out of time. I am thinking of Mr. Bellamy's fall, and of young Mr. Pike's jars, and of the neatness with which people avoid being where they might be useful. I do not like the thought that we have corrected only the visible habit." Miss Hart set the cup down beside her. "You have arranged an arrest, identified a letter, put the whole back to rights, and made poor Jessie feel part of virtue. What is left?" "Human nature," Miss Marple said. "It does not retire when asked. In the morning she went to Tapley's dispensary and asked for nothing. Miss Tapley, who could measure silence to the dram, produced a ledger as if in comfort. 'I have written up the last fortnight,' she said. 'Dr. Brent kept his accounts plain. He wrote the final line last night with Sergeant Barnes in the room.' Did he change anything?" Miss Marple asked. "No," Miss Tapley said. "He corrected a date." "Which?" "The entry for the hall rub. He moved it from 3:30 to 3. He said the footman had misremembered. He recalled the time by an appointment that followed." "The appointment at 4 with Mr. Daltrey," Miss Marple said. "Which never happened." "Dr. Brent keeps his life by the bell," Miss Tapley observed. "That, I suppose, is why it confuses him." On the step Miss Marple stood still a moment. The small thing had remembered what it was. Times had been sharpened, words improved. The correction was itself an untidy act, carried out with tidy means. She went to the vicarage because clergymen hear useful confessions in their corridors. The vicar, harried into benevolence, admitted that Dr. Brent had asked him to pass to Lady Eugenia a note of apology, worded against misunderstanding. "And did you?" "I put it under her front door mat," the vicar confessed, red with the shame of not using a tray. "I did not ring. I had a funeral." "Very right," Miss Marple said. "When we begin to improve the wrong things, we oblige fate." At Rose Cottage, that afternoon she wrote 2 short notes in a hand that looked like no one's. One requested Mr. Pike to bring his drawings to the church at 6 and leave them upon the vestry table. The other invited Mrs. Bellamy's sister to fetch the pliers before evensong, since Mr. Bellamy would require them no more. She did not sign either. She did not need to. People who tidy at the wrong moment come where tidying can be done. She placed the one under Harry's door with a thimble, and left the other with Jessie. A summons no servant resists. At 6:05, she sat in the cool nave with her knitting and watched the vestry through a crack in the curtain. She saw a jar set down with care. She saw plans unrolled where no dust would mark them. And she saw, 10 minutes later, a hand reach for pliers and carry them with the plan to the tower stair, because stairs are where men think better. She followed, soundless as a habit. On the landing the figure stood, neat, embarrassed, and, when he turned at the small sound her needle made, mortified to be found being useful at the wrong time, it wanted one more improvement, Mr. Kerr said miserably, holding out the pliers and the plan together like an apology to a note. If the frame takes weight wrong, the bell mouths complain. I thought, if Mr. Pike would only accept a small brace, one could keep the sound proper, and the village would not know. My dear Mr. Kerr, Miss Marple said softly, you cannot ever so little mechanize honesty. It is too proud. He looked ready to cry, which would have disappointed his choir and his conscience equally. She took the pliers, folded the plan, and put them back into his hands. We shall mention only that you love the bells, she said. Let us leave the rest to Sunday. He nodded, relief and humiliation cancelling each other out like bad harmony, finding its key. On the way down he stopped and touched the rail with a gloved hand, then snatched it back as if from a hot note. I have polished that place for 30 years, he blurted, and never thought of death in it until this week. It will be clean again, Miss Marple said. The trick is to remember what you are cleaning for. When Sergeant Barnes appeared, she gave him not a culprit, for there was none left in need of handcuffs, but a village that had owned its varieties of tidiness and found them insufficient. We have the letter and the little conceits, she said. What remains is to close the bell rope on Sunday and show the parish how to stand. And then I think to teach it how to sit without judging quite so crisply. Barnes scratched his cheek with his pencil. For you do these things with tea and a knitting needle, he said. I am not always sure which is the weapon. Miss Marple smiled. Weapons are what people notice afterwards. During one needs only the right moment and the charity to leave something unsaid. Sunday came in clear and exact, the sort of sky that makes steeples stand straighter. St. Anselm's bell ropes lay coiled with the modesty of things taught their manners again. Miss Marple arrived a little before the rest with Miss Hart, and sat where one may watch a congregation's tide without entering it. She had told Sergeant Barnes the night before, explain only what people can dignify. Let them keep what they can mend. The first hymn was chosen for steadiness. Mr. Kerr set it with a face that had forgiven itself for having nearly loved the wrong improvement. The village came with that brave attention peculiar to Sundays after scandal. Eyes anywhere but on one another, voices pitched a fraction higher than comfort. Tom and George parted only at the rope. Lady Eugenia, in dove grey, took her place like a settled argument. Jessie hovered near the vestry with competence that preferred use to fear. Sergeant Barnes was present with the quietness of official permission. He had sent Dr. Brent to the county after the magistrate heard what must be heard. There had been no fuss. The charge would be manslaughter. The word found its chair and sat. When the second hymn ended, the vicar, kind but newly definite, asked Tom to show how ringers stand and why they do not fall. Tom obliged. He set his hands, showed the catch, and gave a sentence so simple children could keep it. We do not pretend another pair of hands, he said, and the phrase took its seat in the sermon. Some looked stricken, as guilty habits do when turned into doctrine. Others looked grateful to have been handed an excellent excuse for the future. After the blessing, the parish did not disperse. It drifted toward the tower door. Barnes stood where he might be found accidentally. He thanked Tom and George and even Harry, took from Mr. Kerr a hymn book whose corner had caught a drop of dressing, and said he would ask the verger for sand. He was arranging the world as policemen do, when the point is not punishment, but the reduction of temptations. Miss Marple allowed herself one errand. By the lich gate she found Mr. Bellamy with his sister, both arranged in the uncomfortable dignity of convalescence. I am sorry for your stare, she said. It taught two bad lessons, falling and vanity. Mr. Bellamy snorted gently. I fell because I am proud, he said. That is a kind of farming. You reap it. He looked at Harry, standing casual near a buttress. He's a nuisance with jars, Bellamy added, but he will do good if kept near sense. Harry coloured and promised the future with silence, Lady Eugenia came down the path with the air of a woman about to subscribe herself. "The hall will provide for the frame and for a stipend to maintain quiet cleanliness," she said. "Propriety is dearer than repairs." "Order is cheaper than pride," Miss Marple returned. Lady Eugenia accepted the arithmetic. Barnes, whose duty extends to closing scenes, walked with Miss Marple to the square. "There is one matter of habit left," he said. "What remains will never need a witness box," she replied. "It is the immodest help people cannot resist. Mr. Kerr will always adjust a screw. Jessie will always put a letter where it cannot be missed. Such habits make villages tolerable and sometimes dangerous." They paused by the grocer's, where Mr. Cranch stood in his doorway, polished into virtue by anxiety. "I have taken the peppermint out of the penny glass," he announced. "People reach for courage any old way otherwise." "He is not brave," Barnes said as they moved on, "but he is teachable." "Bravery is often the business of being watched," Miss Marple said. Back at Rose Cottage, Miss Hart set the table for a late luncheon. "You look lighter," she said. "I dislike untidiness in endings," Miss Marple answered. She told Miss Hart what she had seen and what she would choose to forget on purpose, which is an art as civilized as embroidery. "And you will stay your fortnight," Miss Hart pleaded. "I shall," said Miss Marple. In the afternoon the square resumed its undignified industry. Children were warned not to pull at imaginary ropes. Men argued about apples. Mrs. Pym discovered that chrysanthemums looked less like a competition and more like mercy. Miss Tapley, observing from the dispensary, rearranged her bottles so the fierce frowned less at the mild. At tea-time, Harry Pike came to Rose Cottage with a coil of paper and an apology that turned into enthusiasm before the second sentence. "If we brace here," he said, "and respect the pause, you can help age without lying to it." "You will take it to Tom," Miss Marple told him. "You will let him throw away what is clever and keep what is honest. And you will never say mechanical in front of Mr. Kerr unless prepared to sing a penitential psalm." Harry laughed and promised to respect pauses. As the light lowered, Sergeant Barnes returned, hat in hand, but with relief that did not embarrass him. "County telephoned," he said. "Brent has signed." He meant a tidy story for the coroner, and lacked the courage to leave the truth ugly. They sat a little back at the cottage. Honey arrived with George's shy pride attached. "For the health room," he said, and then reddened because he had been grand. Miss Marple accepted the jar as if it were a banknote and a blessing. "You see," she told Miss Hart when the boy had gone, "what I mean about repetition. There will always be jars and pliers for lids, and someone ready to decant what ought not be decanted. But there will also be boys who bring honey because somebody thought to build a room with light in it. One must count both in the parish accounts." When Barnes came later to say goodbye, an odd formality for a man who would see her again, tomorrow in the High Street, he found Miss Marple with her knitting neatly, advanced to the sensible point where the heel turns. "I have never liked endings," he admitted. "They make me mistrust beginnings." "That is because you are a policeman," she said, kind. "Beginnings are rarely innocent, but they need not be malignant. See what you have done today. You have shown people where to stand. If one does that often enough, they learn how to sit without their consciences falling off the chair." He laughed a little and then sobered. "There is a part of me, Miss Marple, that wants to believe Lady Eugenia's letter did no harm, only chose a wrong room for a right purpose. There is a larger part of you," she said, "that knows rooms matter. Villages are full of rooms in which we cannot be as we are without becoming ridiculous. The trick, if there is one, is to ask for the room that makes us better." Mr. Daltrey asked the bell to help him, and the bell obliged by telling the truth to everyone else. Evening came in as precisely as it had left the night before, with a dignity that forgave mistakes but did not forget them. Miss Hart fetched the mending basket. Miss Marple carried it to the table. "You will stay yet a few days?" Miss Hart asked. "I should like you to be here when they test the frame." "I shall," said Miss Marple. I'm curious to hear what honesty sounds like when braced. They stitched. The cottage collected the day and folded it. Through the open window came the faintest chime. Mr. Kerr trying a single bell with the careful touch of a man who has learned that improvement is a servant, not a creed. It sounded neither triumphant nor abashed. It sounded like work done properly and ready to be done again tomorrow. Miss Marple set her needle and looked once more in the direction of the church. She thought of Dr. Brent writing his last neat line in a ledger that had run out of room for pride, of Lady Eugenia squaring her hand and allowing sunlight into a room that would count bottles against visits, of Harry Pike discovering that invention is most useful when it listens, of Tom and George, who would hear forever the difference between help and pretend help, of Jessie, whose brooms would always find the kind of dust that clings to letters. Then she smiled her small, satisfied smile, the smile of a woman who has witnessed human nature do its usual thing and yet refuses to despair of it. "There now," she said softly, more to the needles than to Miss Hart. "We have turned the heel." And as the bell stood between notes, ready for the next pull, Miss Marple set her wool in order, as she always did when a village had remembered the shape of its honesty.